Welcome to the fourth President of the United States during the early Republic period, James Madison. Okay, James Madison's previous accomplishments. James Madison is the father of the U.S. Constitution. Now, he's not the only one who has input, he's not the only writer in that sense, but he is the main contributor to it. This is why he gets this name. In addition, he is also one of the main writers of the Federalist Papers seeking to persuade people to adopt the new U.S. Constitution in an attempt to reverse the Articles of Confederation. Additionally, he served as a member of the U.S. House of Representatives after the Constitution was put in place from 1793 to 1797. And then he would serve as Secretary of State in Thomas Jefferson's cabinet. And Jefferson was his best friend. Jefferson lived at Monticello. Madison's house is Montpelier. This was a picture I took when I took a trip to Virginia and went to Monticello, and then right here went to Montpelier. And so the Madison presidency is dominated by the War of 1812. And so since the beginning of the early Republic period, we talked about how Washington had these problems with France as they had their revolution and ultimately Napoleon. And so all these problems will culminate in the fourth presidency, James Madison, and our policy of neutrality will finally come to an end as we will declare war on Great Britain. And so there's several nicknames for this war. One is the Second War of Independence, and the other is the War of Bad Timing. And if you want to take a look at that map, please pause the video because I'm moving on. This begins with Great Britain causing problems in the American Northwest at this time. And so what you see that they begin to support a Shawnee chief named Tecumseh. And so Tecumseh begins to lead Native Americans on these raids, kind of attacking in the American Northwest. So many Americans begin calling for war, and the people who begin calling for war against Great Britain get the nickname the War Hawks. And so a lot of these people are Southern, or they're living in the Western states, and back then the Western states were Kentucky, Ohio, and Tennessee. The main causes, the impressment or the capturing of American sailors by the British, but also the British support of Native Americans like Tecumseh. So in the background, you are looking right here at a political cartoon from the day, basically showing the British scalping Americans and presenting it to their British overlords. And another political cartoon of the day, James Madison fighting it out with John Bull being a representation of England. And so the first of these nicknames, the War of Bad Timing, comes from the fact that we actually declare war on Great Britain based upon our belief that Great Britain has not revoked their attack on American shipping. Well, as it turns out, several days before we declare war on Great Britain, in fact, they had created a formal announcement that they would no longer interfere with U.S. shipping. Unfortunately, back then, communication of the day means that message cannot get to the United States for a good 6 weeks. And so we declare war on Great Britain, in some ways, in an unnecessary way. And so some people will argue that as a result, of course, this war was unnecessary. So we'll talk more about the timing issues. The Second War of Independence is the other nickname that it gets. The U.S. is unprepared to fight this war. We have 16 ships for our Navy. The Army has fewer than 7,000 men. The Democratic Republicans under Thomas Jefferson had consistently been removing parts of the American military, been decreasing the funding for it. Britain itself is fighting Napoleon at the time. So here's a look at kind of an older, defeated Napoleon. And so, but they're fighting Napoleon until 1814 when they finally defeat him at Waterloo. And it's there that after he's defeated, the British will be able to turn all of their troops, all of their navy, back against the United States. So the war at sea. At the beginning of the war, the British tried to blockade the coast of the United States. And so this will be largely a largely fairly successful strategy in trying to blockade the coast. We do have some American ships who do hold their own. And so one of the ships that you are looking at in the background is the USS Constitution. And so the USS Constitution and the USS United States were both successful in sinking British warships. You can go and visit the US Constitution today in Boston. That is where they have the ship. Now, what will eventually happen is William Henry Harrison will become one of the war heroes of the war. William Henry Harrison will take some of this fame and ultimately become president. But William Henry Harrison will fight Tecumseh and the British at the Battle of the Thames, or the Thames, depending on how you want to pronounce that. And so Tecumseh will die there, and Harrison's victory will put an end to the British threat to the northwest. Some of the main stories it relates to the War of 1812 is the British invasion of the Chesapeake Bay. America at this point has actually gone up into Canada and captured and burned Canada's parliament. And so when Great Britain invades up the Chesapeake, this is going to become essentially a split invasion. One will go towards Washington, D.C., and the other will go towards Baltimore. And in this process, what you'll have is James Madison becomes the only president to ever go out and defend, command troops in battle and be fired upon. He goes out there, all 5'4" of them. Dolly Madison is in the White House. Dolly Madison pulls a lot of things out of the White House and saves them. And basically, when she does that, the biggest thing that she pulls out and saves is the famous painting of George Washington that survives to this day. And so everything else in the White House is going to get burned. The British are getting their revenge for what we did in Canada. And so America would essentially watch its capital get burned, and American troops would flee. There would be no ability for us to resist the British. And so the only thing that puts out the fires on the White House is a hurricane, or what we believe to be a hurricane. We can't really tell. And so the heavy rains will put out the fire. They actually also scatter the British troops. So here's a better view of the White House at the time. You can see no east wing, no west wing. Those weren't there yet. And so today, we have had things returned to us over the years from the British, things that they know were actually stolen items from the original White House. The other force goes towards Fort McHenry. And Fort McHenry is a big star fort that defends the harbor of Baltimore. And so basically the British will use their naval ships to bombard Fort McHenry. And there is a lawyer by the name of Francis Scott Key who had been sent out into the harbor to negotiate a prisoner exchange. And while he's out there, the British begin to bombard the fort. Francis Scott Key watches through the night as the British fire off these big rockets, these massive bombs at the fort. And he begins to pen this in the form of what we will eventually call the Star-Spangled Banner. And so it's based on the attack at Fort McHenry that we will get this song, this anthem that we play at all of our sporting events to this day. And so the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. And so he is watching to see if that flag goes down. If that flag goes down, that means that the British have actually captured the fort. And so again, this is what we would call a star fort. There's actually quite a few of these along the American East Coast. Here's another view of Fort McHenry looking back towards Baltimore. And the final battle of the war happens at New Orleans. The British will move south to attack the strategic port of New Orleans. December 14th, 10,000 British troops land. Andrew Jackson commands about 4,000 of them at New Orleans, and basically Jackson will become famous from this battle. Here's a better look at that image. Again, you know these paintings, they like to posture people and make them look very important and heroic. And usually they take the hero and put them higher up or standing tall. And of course, nobody stood like this in battle. The Battle of New Orleans. The British will charge across a field. Uh, Essentially, they'll suffer 2,000 casualties. The Americans are behind an earthwork, and they'll suffer only 71. It is a huge American victory. And the irony of the entire thing is that the war had already been over for several weeks. The British had yet to get the news. And so, again, this plays into the idea of the war of bad timing. The largest American victory actually takes place after the war is over. All these men die for the British when they, in many ways, don't have to. And so the whole war was kind of a don't have to, war of bad timing. And so the British are forced to retreat from Louisiana, and the war will come to an end. The Treaty of Ghent will finalize the war. And so, signed on December 25th, 1814, the results of the war is that it increases American patriotism and nationalism. It also weakens Native American resistance. There'll be less power, less strength by the British to support them in the Americas, and also it brings on U.S. manufacturing and industrialization. You can't trade due to the British blockade, so we're going to have to make things ourselves. Again, quick review, Fort McHenry and the Star-Spangled Banner. Okay, in Baltimore, Maryland. The burning of the White House. The War of 1812 is also when we get the story of Uncle Sam. I'll include a link that kind of explains kind of the origin of that story. But this is where you get Uncle Sam. Andrew Jackson becomes a hero of the War of 1812. Ultimately, will use that fame to become president. And Andrew Jackson, again, you can see him now in this image over at the far right. And ultimately, as well, you get the rise of American industrialization.